Section 22 of The Seen and the Unseen by Richard Marsh. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Sonia. 10. The Robbery on the Stormy Petrel. 1. The case of the robbery on board the Stormy Petrel was notable for one thing, if for no other. In it, the Honourable Augustus Champnell received fees from 3 separate and indeed antagonistic individuals. The Honourable Augustus had finished reading the morning papers and was wondering, for business was slack, what the day might bring forth, when there came a tapping at the door, and there immediately entered 2 servants in livery, bearing between them an iron box, which they placed on a chair. One of them spoke, as if he had been an automaton. "The Marquis of Bawley's compliments to Mr. Champnell, and will Mr. Champnell drown the box in a cistern full of water till the Marquis arrives?" Mr. Champnell stared. "And when will the Marquis arrive?" The Marquis arrived almost as soon as the servants had gone. That ancient peer came hobbling into the room, leaning on 2 sticks, and as soon as he saw the box on the chair, he seemed more than half disposed to back out again. "Didn't the rascals tell you to drown the box in a cistern of water?" "The rascals did. But the Marquis of Bewley will permit me to observe that I always require a sufficient explanation before I act on instructions which I receive from strangers." With Mr. Champnell's assistance, the Marquis took refuge in a chair. "What's your fee?" "My lowest fee is 100 guineas." "Too much." "In the case of the Marquis of Bewley, my lowest fee will be 150 guineas." The Marquis glanced up at him, and leered. "You shall have it for your impudence. The Champnells always were an impudent lot. Find out who sent what is in that box, and you shall have your 150. Here's the key. Look inside. Only mind, gently does it." Unlocking the iron box with the key the Marquis gave him, Mr. Champnell found that it contained other smaller wooden boxes, which were divided from each other by layers of cotton wool. Removing the covers of these wooden boxes, he perceived that each contained what seemed to be some sort of oil can. 13 of them, aren't they?" On counting them, Mr. Champnell discovered that the number was correct. "Lucky number, and pretty playthings, every one of them. All infernal machines, or I am a hatter. They've come raining in on me by every post. If you look at them, you'll see that there is a different postmark on every one of them." "Are you certain that they are infernal machines?" "I'll lay you 10 to 1 in anything you like to name that they are, and leave you to prove the contrary. That's the extent of my certainty, Mr. Champnell. Only if you take my advice, you'll keep them immersed in water until the thing has been shown to demonstration, either one way or the other. I have no desire to be blown to pieces, if you have." "Have you no sort of idea where they come from?" "Once upon a time I was fool enough to enroll myself as a member of a certain secret society. I have broken since then pretty nearly every one of its rules, which I swore to observe, and I think it quite on the cards that these things may have come from some of the society's agents. I'll tell you what I'll do. Instead of 150 guineas, I'll give you 200, if you prove, beyond a shadow of doubt, that they don't. I've come to you instead of going to the police, because I want the thing kept private. But at the same time I am particularly anxious to know if at last the beggars are beginning to try to do what they have threatened to do, times without number." The Marquis's story was a long one, and not a little involved. Some of Mr. Champnell's questions he declined point-blank to answer. When he had gone, Mr. Champnell still found himself in possession of very slight data to enable him to prosecute his researches. He summed the data up in his mind, telling himself finally that they really amounted to nothing at all, and had almost resolved to write to the Marquis and decline the conduct of the case unless he furnished him with fuller information on certain points on which he had refused to give any information at all, when the servant came to announce that Mr. Golden, of the firm of Messrs. Ruby and Golden, was at the door and desirous of an interview. A minute later Mr. Champnell found himself face to face with the junior partner of the famous firm of jewellers, a shrewd, sharp-looking man who wasted no time in coming to the point. "I have been made the victim, Mr. Champnell, of an atrocious outrage, and I come to you first, because the matter is one which requires delicate handling, and second, because the author of the outrage is a member of your own order. I may add that if you succeed in this matter, we may be able to place a good deal of business in your hands, business of a kind which requires the intervention of a diplomatist rather than of a policeman." The Honourable Augustus bowed. "You are acquainted with Lord Hardaway?" Another bow from Mr. Champnell. "His lordship has been a customer of ours for some time, and is so largely in our debt that some months ago we felt bound to intimate that we could not allow him to add to the already large figure of his account. We have recently received information, through side channels, that his lordship was paying his addresses to Miss Bonnier Lees, the sole child and heiress of the eminent soap boiler. And 10 days ago we received a letter from his lordship himself, which was to the effect that he was about to start for a cruise in his yacht, the Stormy Petrel, that Miss Bonnier Lees was to accompany him with other friends, that he had hopes of making Miss Bonnier Lees his wife, and he desired us to send him at once, for his inspection and the ladies', a selection of the finest things we had in stock. In fact, he gave us to understand that matters had reached a stage in which he was anxious to make the lady a handsome present. His lordship went on to add that if he married Miss Bonnier Lees, our account should receive an immediate settlement, while, on the other hand, if he did not marry her, it was quite possible that we should have to whistle. The word was his lordship's own." Where was Lord Hardaway when he wrote this letter? "Staying at Miss Bonnier Lee's own residence in Kent. But the day after we received a telegram from him stating that they had decided to commence the cruise sooner than they had originally intended, that the day following they would be off Deal, on board the yacht, and that the goods were to be sent on board to be examined. The telegram also contained what seemed to me, under the circumstances, to be a somewhat brutal intimation to the effect that if we did not telegraph a reply to say that the goods would be sent off at once, the order would be placed elsewhere." "Did you send the goods?" "My impulse was to telegraph a refusal. In several little matters Lord Hardaway had not used us altogether well, and it seemed to me that in this matter he was not using us altogether well either. There was no necessity, for instance, for him to threaten us with the loss of his custom. My partner, however, Mr. Ruby, would not hear of a refusal. He was naturally unwilling to lose the business which would be associated with what would, probably, be one of the weddings of the season. On one point I did stand firm, as I feared that, if he was the bearer of the goods, Mr. Ruby would quite probably allow himself to be wheedled out of them without receiving any satisfactory promise of payment. I resolved to take the goods myself, which I did do." Mr. Golden paused. At this point of his narrative which he had reached, a certain uneasiness seemed to possess him. "It was about midday when I reached Deal. It was both blowing and raining, and what I should have called a regular gale was on. A sailor with the word Stormy Petrel on his cap came to me at the station, and when I told him who I was, informed me that we must go off to the yacht at once, because his lordship had resolved to weigh anchor if I did not arrive by that train. I had never been to Deal in my life before, and I had some idea that the yacht might be anchored to the pier, but when I got down to the beach I found that there was no pier, and the sailor, pointing to what was merely a speck on the horizon, said, 'There's the Stormy Petrel.' When he said that, and I saw that the yacht was heaven knows how far from land, if I had not felt that the fellow was covertly grinning at me, and that I should never have heard the last of it from Ruby, I should have come straight back to town, which would have been a wiser thing than what I actually did do. I entrusted myself in a cranky boat to the mercy of the, literally, foaming billows." Again Mr. Golden paused. It might have been imagination, but it seemed to the Honourable Augustus that, at the mere recollection of that experience of the horrors of the ocean, Mr. Golden became a little yellow. "I am not ashamed, Mr. Champnell, to own that I am no sailor. I have felt qualms upon the Thames. What I suffered in that cockle-shell of a boat, tossed hither and thither amidst that seething mass of waters, I don't know if it was blowing or raining hardest, I will not now attempt to describe. When I reached the Stormy Petrel, I was more dead than alive. Lord Hardaway received me on deck. He was evidently suffering no inconvenience from the weather. 'Hullo, Golden,' he said, 'you're looking queer.' 'If, my lord,' I answered, 'I am looking as queer as I feel, I must be looking very queer indeed. I had no idea before I left town that such a storm was raging.' 'Storm?' he said. 'You don't call this a storm. It's only a capful of wind. Come below and have a peg.' I went downstairs and I had some brandy. Then I must have had another attack of illness, because the next thing I can remember is Lord Hardaway clapping me on the shoulder and exclaiming, 'I say, Golden, where are those jewels of yours?'" Once more there was a break in Mr. Golden's narrative. He seemed to be oppressed by the weight of his recollections. "It will give you, Mr. Champnell, an adequate idea of my physical condition when I tell you that, until that moment, I had forgotten that I had the jewels on me, and when I add that I had taken with me from town jewels to the gross value of nearly £20,000, you will understand what that statement means. They were contained in a locked leather case, which was attached to a steel belt which was locked about my waist. The keys both of the belt and of the case were in a secret pocket of my waistcoat. See here." Unbuttoning his waistcoat, Mr. Golden disclosed a tiny pocket which was ingeniously contrived in the lining. "When his lordship spoke, I put my hand to my waist, and found that the belt and case had gone, and not only so, my waistcoat was unbuttoned and the keys had vanished." "My lord!" I cried as I staggered to my feet. "I've been robbed." "By Jove!" he exclaimed, "if I didn't think so. Come along, Golden, the thief has just gone overboard with the spoil. If you don't look alive he'll get clear away. You will understand, Mr. Champnell, that I was disorganized both in mind and body, really incapable, in fact, of collecting my thoughts. I allowed his lordship to drag me up above. It seemed to me when I got into the open air that the storm was raging worse than ever. And taking me to the side of the deck, he pointed out a solitary individual who was rowing away from the ship in a little boat. 'There's the thief. I thought there was something suspicious about the way in which he came sneaking up from below. Before we knew what he was up to he had dropped into his boat and was off. If you look alive, Golden, you'll catch him yet red-handed.' The boat in which I had come from shore was still alongside, and before I had a chance to collect my scattered senses, his lordship had not only bundled me into it, but the boat itself was pushed off from the yacht. We chased that boat which contained the solitary rower, as it appeared to me, for hours. I will not dilate on what I still continue to suffer, but through all my agony I urged the rowers in pursuit. As soon as we were within hailing distance, I shouted to the fellow, 'Stop!' Directly I did so, standing up in his boat, he dropped something into the sea. I distinctly saw that he dropped something, but what he was too far off for me to see. When we reached him he declared that he had merely thrown overboard some rubbish, but why he had chosen that singularly inopportune moment he did not condescend to explain. We took him in tow, he seeming not at all unwilling, and at last we reached the land. How thankful I was to do so, no one but myself can have the faintest conception. Hardly had I set foot on terra firma Then I became convinced that I had been duped from first to last. The fellow we had chased turned out to be an honest, simple fisherman, who had been employed to take a telegram from the post office to the yacht, and who protested that he had never left his boat, and that he knew nothing of my belt or case. I believed, and I believe him. I have no doubt whatever that Lord Hardaway was himself the thief. I would have instituted a prosecution directly I returned to town, only Ruby would not hear of it. Mr. Ruby is always fearful of anything in the shape of a scandal. A week has passed. We have heard nothing of his lordship or of the jewels. That, at present, is how the matter stands." "What is it you wish me to do?" "To see that the jewels are returned to us." "And in default?" "We must either have the jewels or a guarantee of payment, a sufficient guarantee, or we prosecute. Here is a list of the jewels that are missing, with the several values attached." Mr. Golden handed the Honourable Augustus a sheet of paper. "You perceive that it is a matter which requires delicate handling." "Quite so. Where is Lord Hardaway now?" "No one seems to have the least idea. As you are aware, the weather has been very boisterous during the last few days, and for all anyone seems to know, he and the Stormy Petrel may be at the bottom of the sea together. Altogether, for us, it is a pleasant state of things." "Was Miss Bonnier Lees on board?" "She was not. It appears only too probable that the whole business was a deliberately planned conspiracy. As I told you at the beginning, Mr. Champnell, I have been made the victim of an atrocious outrage." End of section 22. Section 23 of The Seen and the Unseen by Richard Marsh. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Sonia. 10. The Robbery on the Stormy Petrel. 2. When, Mr. Golden having departed, the Honourable Augustus was left alone, he laughed. The story of the jeweller's sufferings appealed to his sense of humour. He studied the list of the missing jewels. "There appears to be some pretty baubles among them, and they appear to be marked at pretty prices. If Hardaway has got clean away with the spoil, they ought to provide him with a pleasant little nest egg with which to start afresh." He turned to the mantelpiece to get a light for his pipe. Just as he struck a match, his ears were saluted by a curious sound which proceeded from behind his back. "What's that?" With the lighted match in his hand, he turned to listen. The sound continued. It seemed to increase in volume. It was as if some rusty clockwork mechanism had suddenly been set in motion. "It seems to come from the interior of the Marquis of Bewley's precious iron case." The case in question still remained where it had originally been placed, upon a chair. Mr. Champnell went to it and raised the lid. "By George, it does. It strikes me that it comes from inside one of these pretty wooden boxes. From inside this one, unless I am mistaken." He removed the cover from the box in question. The noise did seem to come from inside it. No sooner had he done so than there was a sound as if a damp squib had been exploded. A quantity of what seemed like water was dashed into his face, and there drifted through the room a most unpleasant smoke. The Honourable Augustus was amazed. "It occurs to me that the Marquis was right, and that these ingenious contrivances are infernal machines. Unless I err, one of them has justified its existence by exploding. Considering that there are 12 more of them, I seem to be in a truly comfortable situation. It is a pity Bewlay did not keep them in his possession a little longer, and allow them to explode on his own premises, instead of on mine. What is this stuff on my face?" His head and face were covered with moisture. He allowed a drop to trickle into his mouth. "It tastes like sea water. What is the meaning of this thing? I'll have a look at myself in the glass." As he was moving towards a mirror, something caught his eye which was lying on the floor. What the something's that? He might well ask. What seemed to be a circlet of scintillating light was lying almost at his feet. He picked it up, staring at it when he had it in his hand, with growing bewilderment. A bracelet of diamonds. As I am a sinner, how on earth did it get here? An idea flashed into his brain. Can it be? It can't be. I do believe it is one of Golden's. He examined with eager eyes the list of the missing jewels. It is. Here's the thing itself. A bracelet of 24 diamonds, in a plain gold setting, with pearl fastenings. When closed, the fastening is heart-shaped. 5 pearls in fastening. It is Golden's. Hullo! Another of the Marquis's infernal machines seemed to be evincing an inclination to go off. The words were hardly out of his mouth when it did go off. Indeed, the whole 13 had gone off within 10 minutes. They had evidently been ingeniously contrived to go off as rapidly as possible, one after the other, so, as the schoolboys have it, to keep the pot a-boiling. The room was full of suffocating smoke, Mr. Champnell was drenched with what seemed like sea-water, and he was in the possession of the whole of the missing jewels. They had been vomited forth by the infernal machines. Although this looks as if it were a fairy tale, he told himself, I fancy it has a very simple explanation. As some half-hour after he was driving down Bond Street in a cab, his attention was attracted to an individual who was advancing along the Piccadilly pavement. The man himself! So whatever may have become of the Stormy Petrel, Milord himself is above water. Stopping the cab, springing out of it, hastening towards the individual in question, Mr. Champnell accosted him, a tall, willowy man, with a dark oval face and big, wild, black eyes. I am glad to see, Hardaway, that you're not drowned in spite of the boisterous weather which has recently prevailed in the Channel. You have probably been kept alive in order to be arrested on a warrant emanating from Scotland Yard. Champnell, you don't mean it. Don't I? When a man steals jewels to the value of £20,000, puts them, with about 2 gallons of sea-water, into 13 infernal machines, sends those infernal machines to the address of the Marquis of Burleigh, and they are brought to me and explode and nearly blow me up and the whole place besides, it is generally supposed that that man has done something which necessitates the issue of a warrant. My dear fellow, it was only a joke. For less pointed jokes men have been sent to penal servitude. Lord Hardaway slipped his arm through Mr. Champnell's. I was so devilish wild, and Golden was so devilish sick, that I couldn't help but spoof him. As for Burleigh, I owe him one for a dozen different things. I was bound to be even with him sometime. There was nothing in the tins but water and Golden's jewels. Then it doesn't occur to you that you have been guilty of felony, and also of what a hanging judge might construe as an attempt to murder. I say, Champnell, spare my blushes. I hear, dear boy, you've turned detective. You might do me a good turn, and all in the way of business. The fact is, I'm engaged to be married, the Bonnie Elise. Lord Hardaway winked. It will set me on my legs. I thought that Miss Bonnie Elise was not on board the Stormy Petrel. She wasn't. That's what made me so devilish wild. She was to have gone, but when it began to blow, she hoisted the white feather. I felt that I must have it out of somebody, so I had it out of Golden. But I saw her yesterday, and I made it all right. We're going to be married at once. I'm going to run straight, I swear I am. But if this tale got wind, it might spoil everything. I tell you what, old man, if in the way of business you'll make things square with Ruby and Golden, and with old Bully, I'll give you any sum in reason you like to name. Say a couple of 100 guineas, cash down. A couple of 100 guineas, you say? Mr. Champnell smiled. What at the moment was not quite plain. You don't seem conscious that it is a rather curious proposition which you are making me, especially as I happen to be already retained upon the other side. But I'll do the best for you I can." When the Honourable Augustus reached Messrs. Ruby and Golden's establishment in Bond Street, he was received by both the partners in a private room. "Do I understand, gentlemen, if I return to you the missing jewels, exactly as they left Mr. Golden's hands, that, as they say in the advertisements, no questions will be asked?" Both partners were profuse in their protestations that he might so understand. "Then, in that case, gentlemen, here they are." He placed a leather case before them on the table. The partners stared. "If you will be so good as to examine them at once in my presence, you will perceive that they are intact. You quite understand that no questions are to be asked of anyone, and in particular nothing is to be said to Lord Hardaway. I may mention, by the way, that Lord Hardaway is to be married almost immediately to Miss Bonnier Lees." Mr. Ruby rubbed his hands and smiled. "We are delighted to hear it, Mr. Champnell, delighted. You may rely on us not to breathe a word to Lord Hardaway. We quite understand that it was only a little joke of his. His lordship is so full of humour." Mr. Golden's tone — he was examining the jewels as he spoke — was not quite so effusive. "If you had been in my place and had suffered what I suffered, you might not have seen the joke quite so clearly, Ruby. There is such a thing as being almost too full of humour." Mr. Champnell went straight from Bond Street to the Marquis of Bewlay's. He found the Marquis in his smoking room. "You may make your mind easy on the subject of those infernal machines. Here they are." Mr. Champnell took 13 empty tins from a bag which he was carrying. "They have all gone off, but as they were all filled with water, it would seem as if somebody had been planning a practical joke at your expense. That sort of infernal machine hardly savours of a secret society." "It certainly does not. And though you mayn't think it, Mr. Champnell, it's worth all of 200 guineas to me to know it." "I am very glad indeed to hear it." And so the Honourable Augustus told himself again, when, having returned to his own quarters, he had propped up his feet against the mantel-shelf and was lighting a cigar. "I don't think that's a bad morning stroke of business. 500 guineas for doing nothing at all." End of section 23. Section 24 of The Seen and the Unseen by Richard Marsh. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Sonia. 11. The Houseboat. Chapter 1. I am sure of it. Inglis laid down his knife and fork. He stared round and round the small apartment in a manner which was distinctly strange. My wife caught him up. She laid down her knife and fork. "You're sure of what?" Inglis seemed disturbed. He appeared unwilling to give a direct answer. "Perhaps, after all, it's only a coincidence." But Violet insisted. "What is a coincidence?" Inglis addressed himself to me. "The fact is, Millen, directly I came on board I thought I had seen this boat before." "But I thought you had said that you had never heard of the Water Lily." "Nor have I. The truth is that when I knew it, it wasn't the Water Lily." "I don't understand." "They must have changed the name. Unless I am very much mistaken, this used to be the Sylph." "The Sylph? You don't mean to say that you have never heard of the Sylph?" Inglis asked his question in a tone of voice which was peculiar. "My dear fellow, I am not a Riverine authority. I am not acquainted with every houseboat between Richmond and Oxford. It was only at your special recommendation that I took the Water Lily." "Excuse me, Millen, I advised a houseboat. I didn't specify the Water Lily." "But," asked my wife, What was the matter with this sylph that she should so mysteriously have become the water lily? Inglis fenced with this question in a manner which seemed to suggest a state of mental confusion. Of course, Millen, I know that that sort of thing would not have the slightest influence on you. It is only people of a very different sort who would allow it to have any effect on them. Then, after all, I may be wrong. And in any case, I don't see that it matters. Mr. Inglis, are you suggesting that the sylph was haunted? Haunted? Inglis started. I never dropped a hint about its being haunted. So far as I remember, I never heard a word of anything of the kind. Violet placed her knife and fork together on her plate. She folded her hands upon her lap. Mr. Inglis, there is a mystery. Will you this mystery unfold? Didn't you really ever hear about the sylph? 2 years ago? 2 years ago we were out of England. So you were. Perhaps that explains it. You understand, this mayn't be the sylph. I may be wrong, though I don't think I am. Inglis glanced uncomfortably at the chair on which he was sitting. Why, I believe this is the very chair on which I sat. I remember noticing what a queer shape it was. It was rather an odd-shaped chair. For that matter, all the things on board were odd. Then have you been on board this boat before? Yes. Inglis positively shuddered. I was, once. If it is the sylph, that is. He thrust his hands into his trouser pockets. He leaned back in his chair. A curious look came into his face. It is the sylph, I'll swear to it. It all comes back to me. What an extraordinary coincidence. One might almost think there was something supernatural in the thing. His manner fairly roused me. I wish you would stop speaking in riddles and tell us what you are driving at. He became preternaturally solemn. Millen, I'm afraid I have made rather an ass of myself. I ought to have held my tongue. But the coincidence is such a strange one that it took me unawares, and since I have said so much, I suppose I may as well say more. After dinner I will tell you all there is to tell. I don't think it's a story which Mrs. Millen would like to listen to. Violet's face was a study. I don't understand you, Mr. Inglis, because you are quite well aware it is a principle of mine that what is good for a husband to hear is good for a wife. Come, don't be silly. Let us hear what the fuss is about. I dare say it's about nothing, after all. You think so? Well, Mrs. Millen, you shall hear. He carefully wiped his moustache. He began. 2 years ago there was a houseboat on the river called the Sylph. It belonged to a man named Hambro. He lent it to a lady and a gentleman. She was rather a pretty woman, with a lot of fluffy golden hair. He was a quiet, unassuming-looking man, who looked as though he had something to do with horses. I made their acquaintance on the river. One evening he asked me on board to dine. I sat, as I believe, on this very chair, at this very table. 3 days afterwards they disappeared. Well? I asked. Inglis had paused. So far as I know, he has never been seen or heard of since. And the lady? Some of us were getting up a picnic. We wanted them to come with us. We couldn't quite make out their sudden disappearance. So 2 days after we had missed them, I and another man tried to rout them out. I looked through the window. I saw something lying on the floor. Jarvis, I whispered, I believe that Mrs. Bush is lying on the floor dead drunk. She can't have been drunk 2 days, he said. He came to my side. Why, she's in her nightdress. This is very queer. Inglis, I wonder if the door is locked. It wasn't. We opened it and went inside. Inglis emptied his glass of wine. The woman we had known as Mrs. Bush lay in her nightdress, dead upon the floor. She had been stabbed to the heart. She was lying just about where Mrs. Millen is sitting now. Mr. Inglis! Violet rose suddenly. There is reason to believe that, from one point of view, the woman was no better than she ought to have been. That is the story. But I confess it was not at all the story I had expected it was going to be. I did not altogether like it. Who killed her? That is the question. There was no direct evidence to show. No weapon was discovered. The man we had known as Bush had vanished, as it seemed, off the face of the earth. He had not left so much as a pocket-handkerchief behind him. Everything, both of his and hers, had gone. It turned out that nobody knew anything at all about him. They had no servant. What meals they had on board were sent in from the hotel. Hambro had advertised the Sylph. Bush had replied to the advertisement. He had paid the rent in advance, and Hambro had asked no questions. And what became of the Sylph? She also vanished. She had become a little too notorious. One doesn't fancy living on board a houseboat on which a murder has been committed. One is at too close quarters. I suppose Hambro sold her for what he could get, and the purchaser painted her and rechristened her the Water Lily. But are you sure this is the Sylph? As sure as I am sitting here. It is impossible that I could be mistaken. I still seem to see that woman lying dead just about where Mrs. Millen is standing now. Mr. Inglis! Violet was standing up. She moved away towards me. Inglis left soon afterwards. He did not seem to care to stop. He had scarcely eaten any dinner. In fact, that was the case with all of us. Mason had exerted herself to prepare a decent meal in her cramped little kitchen, and we had been so ungrateful as not even to reach the end of her bill of fare. When Inglis had gone, she appeared in her bonnet and cloak. We supposed that, very naturally, she had taken umbrage. "If you please, ma'am, I'm going." "Mason, what do you mean?" "I couldn't think of stopping in no place in which murder was committed, least of all a houseboat. Not to mention that last night I heard ghosts, if ever anyone heard them yet." "Mason, don't be absurd. I thought you had more sense." "All I can say is, ma'am, that last night, as I lay awake, listening to the splashing of the water, all at once I heard in here the sound of quarrelling. I couldn't make it out. I thought that you and the master was having words. Yet it didn't sound like your voices. Besides, you went on awful. Still, I didn't like to say nothing, because it might have been, and it wasn't my place to say that I had heard. But now I know that it was ghosts." She went. She was not to be persuaded to stay any more than Inglis. She did not even stay to clear the table. I have seldom seen a woman in a greater hurry. As for wages, there was not a hint of them. Staid, elderly, self-possessed female though she was, she seemed to be in a perfect panic of fear. Nothing would satisfy her but that she should, with the greatest possible expedition, shake from her feet the dust of the Water Lily. When we were quit of her, I looked at Violet, and Violet looked at me. I laughed. I will not go so far as to say that I laughed genially. Still, I laughed. "We seem to be in for a pleasant river holiday." "Eric, let us go outside." We went on deck. The sun had already set. There was no moon, but there was a cloudless sky. The air was languorous and heavy. Boats were stealing over the waters. Someone in the distance was playing a banjo accompaniment while a clear girlish voice was singing The Garden of Sleep. The other houseboats were radiant with Chinese lanterns. The Water Lily alone was still in shadow. We drew our deck chairs close together. Violet's hand stole into mine. "Eric, do you know that last night I, too, heard voices?" "You?" I laughed again. "Violet!" "I couldn't make it out at all. I was just going to wake you when they were still." "You were dreaming, child. Inglis' story, confound him and his story, has recalled your dream to mind. I hope you don't wish to follow Mason's example and make a bolt of it. I have paid pretty stiffly for the honour of being the Water Lily tenant for a month, not to mention the fact of disarranging all our plans." Violet paused before she answered. "No, I don't think I want, as you say, to make a bolt of it. Indeed," She nestled closer to my side. It is rather the other way. I should like to see it through. I have sometimes thought that I should like to be with someone I can trust in a situation such as this. Perhaps we may be able to fathom the mystery. Who knows? This tickled me. I thought you had done with romance. With one sort of romance I hope I shall never have done. She pressed my hand. She looked up archly into my face. I knew it, although we were in shadow. With another sort of romance I may be only just beginning. I have never yet had dealings with a ghost. End of section 24. Section 25 of The Seen and the Unseen by Richard Marsh. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Sonia. 11. The Houseboat. Chapter 2. At first I could not make out what it was that had roused me. Then I felt Violet's hand steal into mine. Her voice whispered in my ear, "Eric." I turned over towards her on the pillow. "Be still. They're here." I did as she bade me. I was still. I heard no sound but the lazy rippling of the river. "Who's here?" I asked, when, as I deemed, I had been silent long enough. "Shh." I felt her finger pressed against my lips. I was still again. The silence was broken in rather a peculiar manner. "I don't think you quite understand me." The words were spoken in a man's voice, as it seemed to me, close behind my back. I was so startled by the unexpected presence of a third person that I made as if to spring up in bed. My wife caught me by the arm. Before I could remonstrate or shake off her grasp, a woman's laughter rang through the little cabin. It was too metallic to be agreeable. And the woman's voice replied, "I understand you well enough. Don't you make any error." There was a momentary pause. "You don't understand me, fool." The first 4 words were spoken with a deliberation which meant volumes, while the final epithet came with a sudden malignant ferocity which took me aback. The speaker, whoever he might be, meant mischief. I sprang up and out of bed. "What are you doing here?" I cried. I addressed the inquiry apparently to the vacant air. The moonlight flooded the little cabin. It showed clearly enough that it was empty. My wife sat up in bed. "Now," she observed, "you've done it." "Done what? Who was that speaking?" "The voices." "The voices? What voices? I'll voice them. Where the dickens have they gone?" I moved towards the cabin door with the intention of pursuing my inquiries further. Violet's voice arrested me. "It is no use your going to look for them. They will not be found by searching. The speakers were Mr. and Mrs. Bush." "Mr. and Mrs. Bush?" Violet's voice dropped to an awful whisper. "The murderer and his victim." I stared at her in the moonlight. Inglis's pleasant little story had momentarily escaped my memory. Suddenly aroused from a dreamless slumber, I had not yet had time to recall such trivialities. Now it all came back in a flash. "Violet," I exclaimed, "have you gone mad?" "They are the voices which I heard last night. They are the voices which Mason heard. Now you have heard them. If you had kept still, the mystery might have been unravelled. The crime might have been re-acted before our eyes, or at least within sound of our ears." I sat down upon the ingenious piece of furniture which did duty as a bed. I seemed to have struck upon a novel phase in my wife's character. It was not altogether a pleasing novelty. She spoke with a degree of judicial calmness which, under all the circumstances, I did not altogether relish. "Violet, I wish you wouldn't talk like that. It makes my blood run cold." "Why should it? My dear Eric, I have heard you yourself say that in the presence of the seemingly mysterious our attitude should be one of passionless criticism. A mysterious crime has been committed in this very chamber." I shivered. Surely it is our duty to avail ourselves of any opportunities which may offer and which may enable us to probe it to the bottom. I made no answer. I examined the doors. They were locked and bolted. There was no sign that anyone had tampered with the fastenings. I returned to bed. As I was arranging myself between the sheets, Violet whispered in my ear, "Perhaps if we are perfectly quiet they may come back again." I am not a man given to adjectives, but I felt adjectival then. I was about to explain, in language which would not have been wanting in force, that I had no desire that they should come back again, when— "You had better give it to me." The words were spoken in a woman's voice, as it seemed, within 12 inches of my back. The voice was not that of a lady. I should have said without hesitation, had I heard the voice under any other circumstances, that the speaker had been born within the sound of Bow bells. Had I? It was a man's voice which put the question. There was something about the tone in which the speaker put it which reminded one of the line in the People's Ballad, "It ain't exactly what he says, it's the nasty way he says it." The question was put in a very nasty way indeed. "Yes, my boy, you had." "Indeed?" "Yes, you may say indeed, but if you don't, I tell you what I'll do. I'll spoil you." "And what, my dear Gertie, am I to understand by the mystic threat of spoiling me?" "I'll go straight to your wife, and I'll tell her everything." "Oh, you will you?" There was a movement of a chair. The male speaker was getting up. "Yes, I will." There was a slight pause. One could fancy that the speakers were facing each other. One could picture the look of impudent defiance upon the woman's countenance, the suggestion of coming storm upon that of the man. It was the man's voice which broke the silence. "It is odd, Gertrude, that you should have chosen this evening to threaten me, because I myself had chosen this evening, I won't say to threaten, but to make a communication to you." "Give me a match." The request came from the woman. "With pleasure. I will give you anything, my dear Gertrude, within reason." There was another pause. In the silence I seemed to hear my wife holding her breath, as I certainly was holding mine. All at once there came a sound of scratching, a flash of light. It came so unexpectedly, and such was the extreme tension of my nerves, that, with a stifled exclamation, I half rose in bed. My wife pressed her hand against my lips. She held me down. She spoke in so attenuated a whisper that it was only because all my senses were so keenly on the alert that I heard her. "You goose! He's only striking a match." He might have been, but who? She took things for granted. I wanted to know. The light continued flickering to and fro, as a match does flicker. I would have given much to know who held it, or even what was its position in the room. As luck had it, my face was turned the other way. My wife seemed to understand what was passing in my mind. "There is no one there," she whispered. No one, I presumed, but the match. I took it for granted that was there. Though I did not venture to inquire, I felt that I might not have such perfect control over my voice as my wife appeared to have. While the light continued to flicker, there came stealing into my nostrils — I sniffed, the thing was unmistakable — the odour of tobacco. The woman was lighting a cigarette. I knew it was the woman because presently there came this request from the man. "After you with the light, my dear." I presumed that the match was past. Immediately the smell of tobacco redoubled. The man had lit a cigarette as well. I confess that I resented, silently but still strongly, the idea of two strangers, whether ghosts or anybody else, smoking uninvited in my cabin. The match went out. The cigarettes were lit. The man continued speaking. "The communication, my dear Gertrude, which I intended to make to you was this. The time has come for us to part." He paused, possibly for an answer. None came. "I need not enlarge on the reasons which necessitate our parting. They exist." Pause again. Then the woman. "What are you going to give me?" "One of the reasons which necessitate our parting, A very strong reason, as you, I am sure, will be the first to admit, is that I have nothing left to give you." "So you say." "Precisely. So I say, and so I mean." "Do you mean that you are going to give me nothing?" "I mean, my dear Gertrude, that I have nothing to give you. You have left me nothing." "Pah!" The sound which issued from the lady's lips was expressive of the most complete contempt. "Look here, my boy, you give me 100 sovereigns, or I'll spoil you." Pause again. Probably the gentleman was thinking over the lady's observation. "What benefit do you think you will do yourself by what you call spoiling me?" "Never mind about that. I'll do it. You think I don't know all about you, but I do. Perhaps I'm not so soft as you think. Your wife's got some money, if you haven't. Suppose you go back and ask her for some. You've treated me badly enough. I don't see why you shouldn't go and treat her the same. She wouldn't make things warm for you if she knew a few things I could tell her. Not at all. You give me 100 sovereigns, or, I tell you straight, I'll go right to your house and I'll tell her all." "Oh, no, you won't." "Won't I? I say I will." "Oh, no, you won't." "I say I will. I've warned you, that's all. I'm not going to stop here talking stuff to you. I'm going to bed. You can go and hang yourself for all I care." There was a sound, an indubitable sound, the sound of a pair of shoes being thrown upon the floor. There were other sounds, equally capable of explanation, sounds which suggested — I wish the printer would put it in small type — that the lady was undressing. Undressing, too, with scant regard to ceremony. Garments were thrown off and tossed higgledy-piggledy here and there. They appeared to be thrown, with sublime indifference, upon table, chairs, and floor. I even felt something alight upon the bed. Some feminine garment, perhaps, which, although it fell by no means heavily, made me conscious, as it fell, of the most curious sensation I had in all my life, till then, experienced. It seemed that the lady, while she unrobed, continued smoking. From her next words it appeared that the gentleman, also smoking, stood and stared at her. "Don't stand staring at me like a gawk. I'm going to turn in." "And I'm going to turn out. Not, as you suggested, to hang myself, but to finish this cigarette upon the roof. Perhaps when I return you will be in a more equable frame of mind." "Don't you flatter yourself. What I say I mean. 100 sovereigns, or I tell your wife." He laughed very softly, as though he was determined not to be annoyed. Then we heard his footsteps as he crossed the floor. The door opened, then closed. We heard him ascend the steps. Then, with curious distinctness, his measured tramp, tramp, as he moved to and fro upon the roof. In the cabin for a moment there was silence. Then the woman said, with a curious faltering in her voice, "I'll do it. I don't care what he says." There was a choking in her throat. "He don't care for me a bit." Suddenly she flung herself upon her knees beside the bed. She pillowed her head and arms upon the coverlet. I lay near the outer edge of the bed, which was a small one, by the way. As I lay I felt the pressure of her limbs. My sensations, as I did, I am unable to describe. After a momentary interval there came the sound of sobbing. I could feel the woman quivering with the strength of her emotion. Violet and I were speechless. I do not think that for the instant we could have spoken, even had we tried. The woman's presence was so evident, her grief so real. As she wept, disjointed words came from her. "I've given everything for him. If he only cared for me, if he only did." All at once, with a rapid movement, she sprang up. The removal of the pressure was altogether unmistakable. I was conscious of her resting her hands upon the coverlet to assist her to her feet. I felt the little jerk, then the withdrawal of the hands. She choked back her sobs when she had gained her feet. Her tone was changed. What a fool I am to make a fuss. He don't care for me. Not that." We heard her snap her fingers in the air. "He never did. Us women are always fools. We're all the same. I'll go to bed." Violet clutched my arm. She whispered, in that attenuated fashion she seemed to have caught the trick of, "She's getting into bed. We must get out." It certainly was a fact someone was getting into bed. The bedclothes were moved. Not our bedclothes, but some phantom coverings. We heard them rustle. We were conscious of a current of air across our faces, as someone caught them open. And then someone stepped upon the bed. "Let's get out!" gasped Violet. End of section 25. Section 26 of The Seen and the Unseen by Richard Marsh. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Sonia. 11. The Houseboat. Chapter 3. She moved away from me. She squeezed herself against the side of the cabin. She withdrew her limbs from between the sheets. As for me, the person who had stepped upon the bed had actually stepped upon me, and that without seeming at all conscious of my presence. Someone sat down plump upon the sheet beside me. That was enough. I took advantage of my lying on the edge of the bed to slip out upon the floor. I might possess an unsuspected capacity for undergoing strange experiences, but I drew the line at sleeping with a ghost. The moonlight streamed across the room. As I stood, in something very like a state of nature on the floor, I could clearly see Violet cowering on the further side of the bed. I could distinguish all her features. But when I looked upon the bed itself, there was nothing there. The moon's rays fell upon the pillow. They revealed its snowy whiteness. There seemed nothing else it could reveal. It was untenanted. And yet, if one looked closely at it, it seemed to be indented, just as it might have been indented had a human head been lying there. But about one thing there could be no mistake whatever. My ears did not play me false. I heard it too distinctly. The sound made by a person who settles himself between the sheets, and then the measured respiration of one who composes himself to slumber. I remained there silent. On her hands and knees Violet crept towards the foot of the bed. When she had gained the floor, she stole on tiptoe to my side. I did not dare to step across her. I felt her, as she nestled to me, give me a little shiver. I could not do it. Can you see her? What a fool I am! As Violet asked her question, there came this observation from the person in the bed, whom, by the way, I could not see. There was a long-drawn sigh. "Ah, what fools all we women are! What fools!" There was a sincerity of bitterness about the tone, which, coming as it did from an unseen speaker, one so near and yet so far, had on one a most uncomfortable effect. Violet pressed closer to my side. The woman in the bed turned over. Overhead there still continued the measured tramping of the man. We were conscious, in some subtle way, that the woman lay listening to the footsteps. They spoke more audibly to her ears even than to ours. "Ollie, Ollie," she repeated the name softly to herself, with a degree of tenderness which was in startling contrast to her previous bitterness. "I wish you would come to bed." She was silent. There was only the sound of her gentle breathing. Her bitter mood had been but transient. She was falling asleep with words of tenderness upon her lips. Above, the footsteps ceased. All was still. There was not even the murmur of the waters. The wife and I, side by side, stood looking down upon what seemed an empty bed. "She is asleep," said Violet. It seemed to me she was. Although I could not see her, it seemed to me she was. I could hear her breathing as softly as a child. Violet continued whispering. "How strange! Eric, what can it mean?" I muttered a reply. "A problem for the Psychical Research Society." "It seems just like a dream." I wish it were a dream. Shh! There is someone coming down the stairs." There was. At least, if we could trust our ears, there was. Apparently the man above had had enough of solitude. We heard him move across the roof, then pause just by the steps, then descend them one by one. It seemed to us that in this step there was something stealthy, that he was endeavouring not to arouse attention, to make as little noise as possible. Halfway down he paused. At the foot he paused again. "He's listening outside the door." It almost seemed that he was. We stood and listened too. "Let's get away from the bed." My wife drew me with her. At the opposite end of the cabin was a sort of little alcove, which was screened by a curtain, and behind which were hung one or two of our garments which we were not actually using. Violet drew me within the shadow of this alcove. I say drew me because, offering no resistance, I allowed myself to be completely passive in her hands. The alcove was not large enough to hold us. Still the curtain acted as a partial screen. The silence endured for some moments. Then we heard without a hand softly turning the handle of the door. While I was wondering whether, after all, I was not the victim of an attack of indigestion, or whether I was about to witness an attempt at effecting a burglarious entry into a houseboat, a strange thing happened, the strangest thing that had happened yet. As I have already mentioned, the moon's rays flooded the cabin. This was owing to the fact that a long, narrow casement, which ran round the walls near the roof of the cabin, had been left open for the sake of admitting air and ventilation. But save for the moonbeams, the cabin was unlighted. When, however, we heard the handle being softly turned, a singular change occurred. It was like the transformation scene in a theatre. The whole place, all at once, was brilliantly illuminated. The moonbeams disappeared. Instead, a large swinging lamp was hanging from the centre of the cabin. So strong was the light which it shed around that our eyes were dazzled. It was not our lamp. We used small hand lamps which stood upon the table. By its glare we saw that the whole cabin was changed. For an instant we failed to clearly realize in what the change consisted. Then we understood it was a question of decoration. The contents of the cabin, for the most part, were the same, though they looked newer, and the positions of the various articles were altered. But the panels of the cabin of the Water Lily were painted blue and white. The panels of this cabin were coloured chocolate and gold. "Eric, it's the sylph!" The suggestion conveyed by my wife's whispered words, even as she spoke, occurred to me. I understood where, for Inglis, had lain the difficulty of recognition. The two cabins were the same, and yet they were not. It was just as though someone had endeavoured, without spending much cash, to render one as much as possible unlike the other. In this cabin there were many things which were not ours. In fact, so far as I can see, there was nothing which was ours. Strange articles of costume were scattered about. The table was covered with a curious litter, and on the ingenious article of furniture which did duty as a bed, and which stood where our bed stood, and which indeed seemed to be our bed, there was someone sleeping. As my startled eyes travelled round this amazing transformation scene, at last they reached the door. There they stayed. Mechanically I shrank back nearer to the wall. I felt my wife tighten her grasp upon my hand. The door was open some few inches. Through the aperture thus formed there peered a man. He seemed to be listening. It was so still that one could hear the gentle breathing of the woman sleeping in the bed. Apparently satisfied, he opened the door sufficiently wide to admit of his entering the cabin. My impression was that he could not fail to perceive us, yet to all appearances he remained entirely unconscious of our neighbourhood. He was a man certainly under 5 feet 6 in height. He was slight in build, very dark, with face clean shaven. His face was long and narrow. In dress and bearing he seemed a gentleman, yet there was that about him which immediately reminded me of what Inglis had said of the man Bush. He looked as though he had something to do with horses. He stood for some seconds in an attitude of listening, so close to me that I had only to stretch out my hand to take him by the throat. I did not do it. I don't know what restrained me. I think, more than anything, it was the feeling that these things which were passing before me must be passing in a dream. His face was turned away. He looked intently towards the sleeping woman. After he had had enough of listening, he moved towards the bed. His step was soft and cat-like. It was absolutely noiseless. Glancing down, I perceived that he was without boots or shoes. He was in his stockinged feet. I had distinctly heard the tramping of a pair of shoes upon the cabin roof. I had heard them descend the steps. Possibly he had paused outside the door to take them off. When he reached the bed he stood looking down upon the sleeper. He stooped over her, as if the better to catch her breathing. He whispered softly, "Gertie." He paused for a moment as if for an answer. None came. Standing up he put his hand, as it seemed to me, into the bosom of his flannel shirt. He took out a leather sheath. From the sheath he drew a knife. It was a long, slender, glittering blade. Quite 12 inches in length. At no part was it broader than my little finger. With the empty sheath in his left hand, the knife behind his back in his right, he again leaned over the sleeper. Again he softly whispered, "Gertie." Again there was no answer. Again he stood upright, turning his back towards the bed, so that he looked towards us. His face was not an ugly one, though the expression was somewhat saturnine. On it at the instant there was a peculiar look, such a look as I could fancy upon the face of a jockey who, toward the close of a great race, settles himself in the saddle with the determination to finish well. The naked blade he placed upon the table, the empty sheath beside it. Then he moved towards us. My first thought was that now at last we were discovered, but something in the expression of his features told me that this was not so. He approached us with an indifference which was amazing. He passed so close to us that we were conscious of the slight disturbance of the air caused by his passage. There was a Gladstone bag on a chair within 2 feet of us. Picking it up, he bore it to the table. Opening it out, he commenced to pack it. All manner of things he placed within it, both masculine and feminine belongings, even the garments which the sleeper had taken off, and which lay scattered on the chair and on the floor, even her shoes and stockings. When the bag was filled, he took a long brown ulster, which was thrown over the back of a chair. He stuffed the pockets with odds and ends. When he had completed his operations, the cabin was stripped of everything except the actual furniture. He satisfied himself that this was so by overhauling every nook and corner, in the process passing and repassing Violet and me with a perfect unconcern which was more and more amazing. Being apparently at last clear in his mind upon that point, he put on the ulster and the dark cloth cap, and began to fasten the Gladstone bag. While he was doing so, his back being turned to the bed, without the slightest warning, the woman in the bed sat up. The man's movements had been noiseless. He had made no sound which could have roused her. Possibly some sudden intuition had come to her in her sleep. However that might be, she all at once was wide awake. She stared round the apartment with wondering eyes. Her glance fell on the man, dressed as for a journey. "Where are you going?" The words fell from her lips as unawares. Then some sudden conception of his purpose seemed to have flown to her brain. She sprang out of bed with a bound. "You shan't go!" she screamed. She rushed to him. He put his hand on the table. He turned to her. Something flashed in the lamplight. It was the knife. As she came he plunged it into her side right to the hilt. For an instant he held her, spitted on the blade. He put his hand to her throat. He thrust her from him. With the other hand he extricated the blade. He let her fall upon the floor. She had uttered a sort of sigh as the weapon was being driven home. Beyond that, she had not made a sound. All was still. He remained for some seconds looking down at her as she lay. Then he turned away. We saw his face. It was, if possible, paler than before. A smile distorted his lips. He stood for a moment as if listening. Then he glanced round the cabin as if to make sure that he was unobserved. His black eyes travelled over our startled features in evident unconsciousness that we were there. Then he glanced at the blade in his hand. As he did so he perceptibly shuddered. The glittering steel was obscured with blood. As he perceived that this was so, he gasped. He seemed to realize for the first time what it was that he had done. Taking an envelope from an inner pocket of his ulster, he began to wipe the blood from off the blade. While doing so, his wandering glance fell upon the woman lying on the floor. Some new aspect of the recumbent figure seemed to strike him with a sudden horror. He staggered backwards. I thought he would have fallen. He caught at the wall to help him stand, caught at the wall with the hand which held the blade. At that part of the cabin the wall was doubly panelled half-way to the roof. Between the outer and the inner panel there was evidently a cavity, because, when in his sudden alarm he clutched at the wall, the blade slipped from his relaxing grasp and fell between the panels. Such was his state of panic that he did not appear to perceive what had happened. And at that moment a cry rang out upon the river. Possibly it was someone hailing the keeper of the lock. "Ahoy!" The sound seemed to fill him with unreasoning terror. He rushed to the table. He closed the Gladstone with a hurried snap. He caught it up. He turned to flee. As he did so, I stepped out of the alcove. I advanced right in front of him. I cannot say whether he saw me or whether he didn't, but he seemed to see me. He started back. A look of the most awful terror came on his countenance. And at that same instant the whole scene vanished. I was standing in the cabin of the Water Lily. The moon was stealing through the little narrow casement. Violet was creeping to my side. She stole into my arms. I held her to me. "Eric," she moaned. For myself, I am not ashamed to own that, temporarily, I had lost the use of my tongue. When, in a measure, the faculty of speech returned to me, "Was it a dream?" I whispered. "It was a vision." "A vision?" I shuddered. "Look." As I spoke she turned to look. There, in the moonbeams, we saw a woman in her nightdress, lying on the cabin floor. We saw that she had golden hair. It seemed to us that she was dead. We saw her but a moment. She was gone. It must have been imagination. We know that these things are not, but it belonged to that order of imagination which is stranger than reality. My wife looked up at me. "Eric, it is a vision which has been sent to us in order that we may expose in the light of day a crime which was hidden in the night." I said nothing. I felt for a box of matches on the table. I lit a lamp. I looked round and round the cabin, holding the lamp above my head the better to assist my search. It was with a feeling of the most absurd relief that I perceived that everything was unchanged, that, so far as I could see, there was no one there but my wife and I. "I think, Violet, if you don't mind, I'll have some whiskey." She offered no objection. She stood and watched me as I poured the stuff into a glass. I am bound to admit that the spirit did me good. "And what," I asked, "do you make of the performance we have just now witnessed?" She was still. I took another drink. There can be no doubt that, under certain circumstances, whiskey is a fluid which is not to be despised. Have we both suddenly become insane, or do you attribute it to the cucumber we ate at lunch? How strange that Mr. Inglis should have told us the story only this afternoon. I wish Mr. Inglis had kept the story to himself entirely. They were the voices which I heard last night. They were the voices Mason heard. It was all predestined. I understand it now. I wish that I could say the same. I see it all. She pressed her hands against her brow. Her eyes flashed fire. I see why it was sent to us, what it is we have to do. Eric, we have to find the knife. I began to fear from her frenzied manner that her brain must in reality be softening. What knife? The knife which he dropped between the panels. The boat has only been repainted. We know that in all essentials the Sylph and the Water Lily are one and the same. Mr. Inglis said that the weapon which did the deed was never found. No adequate search was ever made. It is waiting for us where he dropped it. My dear Violet, don't you think you had better have a little whiskey? It will calm you. Have you a hammer and a chisel? What do you want them for? It was here that he was standing. It was here that he dropped the knife. She had taken up her position against the wall at the foot of the bed. Frankly, I did not like her manner at all. It was certainly where, in the latter portion of that nightmare, the fellow had been standing. "I will wrench this panel away." She rapped against the particular panel with her knuckles. "Behind it we shall find the knife." "My dear Violet, this houseboat isn't mine. We cannot destroy another man's property in that wanton fashion. He will hardly accept as an adequate excuse the fact that at the time we were suffering from a severe attack of indigestion." "This will do." She took a large carving knife out of the knife basket which was on the shelf close by her. She thrust the blade between the panel and the woodwork. It could scarcely have been securely fastened. In a surprisingly short space of time she had forced it loose. Then, grasping it with both her hands, she hauled the panel bodily away. "Eric, it is there!" Something was there, resting on a little ledge which had checked its fall onto the floor beneath. Something which was covered with paint and dust and cobwebs, and Violet all at once grew timid. "You take it. I dare not touch the thing." "It is very curious. Something is there. And, by George, it is a knife." It was a knife. The knife which we had seen in the vision, the dream, the nightmare, call it what you will, the something which had seemed so real. There was no mistaking it, tarnished though it was, the long slender blade which we had seen the man draw from the leather sheath. Stuck to it by what was afterwards shown to be coagulated blood was an envelope, the envelope which we had seen the fellow take from his pocket to wipe off the crimson stain. It had adhered to the blade. When the knife fell, the envelope fell too. "At least," I murmured as I stared at this grim relic, "this is a singular coincidence." The blood upon the blade had dried. It required but little to cause the envelope to fall away. As a matter of fact, while I was still holding the weapon in my hand, it fell to the floor. I picked it up. It was addressed in a woman's hand. "Francis Joynes, Esquire, Fairley, Streatham." I at once recognized the name as that of a well-known owner of racehorses, and so-called gentleman rider. Not the least singular part of all that singular story was that the letter inside that envelope, which was afterwards opened and read by the proper authorities, was from Mr. Joynes's wife. It was a loving, tender letter from a wife who was an invalid abroad to a husband whom she supposed was thinking of her at home. Mr. Joynes was never arrested, and that for this sufficient reason, that when the agents of the law arrived at his residence, Mr. Joynes was dead. He had committed suicide on the very night on which we saw that, call it vision, on board the Water Lily. I viewed the corpse against my will. I was not called in evidence. Had I been, I was prepared to swear, as was my wife, that Mr. Joynes was the man whom I had seen in a dream that night. It was shown at the inquest that he had suffered of late from horrid dreams, that he had scarcely dared to sleep. I wonder if, in that last and most awful of his dreams, he had seen my face, seen it as I saw his. It was afterwards shown from inquiries which were made that Mr. Joynes and Mr. Bush, tenant of the Sylph, were beyond all doubt one and the same person. On the singular circumstances which caused that discovery to be made, I offer no comment. End of section 26. Section 27 of The Seen and the Unseen by Richard Marsh. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Sonia. 12. The Duke, a Fiction of the Future. 1. Mrs. Paynter buttonholed a porter. "Can you tell me in which carriage the Earl of Datchet is travelling?" "Who, ma'am?" "The Earl of Datchet. Or can you point him out to me?" "No, ma'am, I can't. I don't know no such gentleman. By your leave, ma'am." Without her leave, the porter went off with his load of luggage. The lady turned to her daughter. "How very uncivil the servants are upon this line." The young lady said nothing. She simply regarded her mother with an expression of placid scorn. "I wonder if this guard can tell me." A guard came hurrying along the platform. The lady laid hands of violence on him. "Guard, can you tell me which is the Earl of Datchet?" The Earl of Datchet, madam. Is he travelling by this train? I saw in Fashion that the Earl of Datchet intended to travel by this morning's tidal train to Paris. Isn't this the tidal train? This is the tidal train, but I don't know anything about the Earl of Datchet. Are you going by this train, madam? Of course I am. But, guard. The lady's hand stole towards her purse. I particularly wish to travel in the same compartment as his lordship. I am afraid, madam, that I really don't know anything about his lordship. And if you're going, you'd better get in. They're starting. The guard opened the carriage door. Is this your luggage? He signalled to a porter. Look alive. Attend to this luggage. My dear mother, observed Miss Paynter when the heap of wraps had been bundled in, are you coming? It's most annoying, began the lady. The guard cut her short. Now, madam, if you please. Almost before Mrs. Paynter knew it, she was settling herself in the corner of the carriage opposite her daughter. Before she had settled herself, the train was off, and before the train was fairly under way, she was favouring Miss Paynter with some remarks of a personal nature. Really, Edith, you are the most trying person I ever encountered. You know perfectly well that if I hadn't seen it in the paper I should never have dreamt of crossing to-day, and especially by this particular train, and yet you won't give me the slightest help or assistance of any kind. And now my whole labour's thrown away, and my whole purpose spoiled. My dear mother, what does it matter? The young lady not only spoke with her lips, but also with her eyes. With her organs of vision she drew her mother's attention to the fact that they were not alone in the carriage. The elder lady grasped her daughter's meaning. But as she glanced at the stranger at the other end, she scarcely took that advantage of the hint which she was intended to take. And now, although you know how much I like to have a carriage to myself, and how much I object to travelling with strangers, you have allowed that insolent man, and I am thankful to think that he lost the 5 shillings which I quite intended to give him, to put us just where it pleased him. It's just like you. To this observation Miss Paynter answered nothing. She looked at her mother, and out of the corners of her eyes she peeped at the stranger. As she peeped she smiled. It was but the faintest shadow of a smile, but it was certainly a smile. The stranger was a solid-looking young man, short and broad. He had rather a vacuous expression of countenance. His cheeks, which were innocent of whiskers, were fat and red. Altogether he did not seem to be the sort of person who was likely to be hurt by a trifle, which, under the circumstances, was perhaps as well. None the less, he appeared curiously disconcerted by a remark which Mrs. Paynter all at once addressed to him. "Excuse me, sir, but are you acquainted with the Earl of Datchet?" "Beg pardon?" The young gentleman had his feet on the seat in front of him, his hat tilted over his eyes, and his hands in his trousers pockets, and was probably anathematizing with himself for not having gone at once into a smoking carriage, instead of endeavouring to secure a whole compartment to himself for the solitary enjoyment, in defiance of the company's by-laws, of a fragrant weed. But on Mrs. Paynter's addressing to him her inquiry, his feet went off the cushions, his hat from over his eyes, and his hands from out of his pockets, with a celerity which was comical. "I merely inquired if you were acquainted, by sight, with the person of the Earl of Datchet." When this question was put to him, the stranger's demeanour was really singular. He half rose from his seat, and stared. "Well, I'm blowed! That's good!" "Sir?" Mrs. Paynter regarded him through her glasses with supercilious surprise. The stranger transferred his glance from the mother to the daughter. As it fell upon the daughter, he started again. "Beg pardon, I didn't notice. Did you ask me if I knew Datchet?" Miss Paynter smiled. She seemed tickled by the stranger's manner. "It was not I, it was my mother." Mrs. Paynter did not smile. "Pray, Edith, do not let us trouble this person further. I merely made a commonplace inquiry. I perceive that I made a mistake." If the lady's manner was meant to be crushing, and it seemed that it was, the stranger remained uncrushed. He only stared the more. "How?" Mrs. Paynter leaned back in her corner. "My dear Edith, do not let us trouble this person further." "But I do know, Datchet." Up went the lady's glasses again. But if she meant to stare the stranger out of countenance, she simply scored another failure. "When you say Datchet, are you referring to the Earl of Datchet?" "Dickie Datchet. Yes, that's him." "Dickie Datchet? Really, you appear to be upon intimate terms with his lordship. Do you happen to be aware if his lordship is travelling by this train?" "I'll bet a guinea he isn't." "Indeed? I understood upon good authority that he intended to do so." "Not he. Dickie's at Boulogne." "At Boulogne, is he? You seem to have a close acquaintance with his lordship's movements. May I ask if you are a friend of his?" Mrs. Paynter was quite incapable of anything more cutting in the way of sarcastic suggestion than her manner conveyed. But in spite of it, the stranger seemed beautifully unconscious that there was any intention of the kind. "Well, it depends on what you call a friend." "It depends, as you say, very much indeed upon what you call a friend." "Of course we were kids together." "Kids together?" "Youngsters, don't you know? I'm the Duke of Staines." You are the—" For the life of her, Mrs. Paynter could have got no further. The stranger supplied the rest of the sentence. "The Duke of Staines." He turned to Miss Paynter. "Are you going to Boulogne?" "We were thinking of going to Paris." "Oh." His countenance fell. "I wish you were going to Boulogne." "Why?" "Well, I'm going to Boulogne." Miss Paynter smiled outright at this. She had more presence of mind than her mother. "The inference conveyed is very flattering." "Is it? I don't know." He stared at her stolidly. Mrs. Paynter found her breath again. "Did I understand you to say— really, I had no idea, you must excuse me— did I understand you to say that you were the Duke of Staines?" "That's me." Mrs. Paynter regarded him askance. She could not make up her mind if he was or was not making fun of her. She was not a wise woman. She had never before come into personal contact with any member of the British aristocracy. Could such an extremely vulgar individual as this one appeared to be really be a duke? She endeavoured, to the best of her small ability, to make sure of her ground. "You don't happen to have a card about you?" "Oh, I always carry a pack when I'm going anywhere, but I don't care to play." "You don't care to what?" "To play. Unless you feel uncommonly keen." Miss Paynter laughed. "You misunderstand my mother. She is not asking you for a pack of cards. She doesn't, as a rule, play cards in a train. But for a visiting card." "Oh, I see. Exchange pasteboards and that sort of thing. Daresay I've got one somewhere." From a pocket-book which seemed to contain a very miscellaneous collection, he produced, after long searching, a visiting card. It was a good deal soiled and the corners were dog's-eared. He commented on its defects as he handed it to Mrs. Paynter. "There's a few figures on the back, but perhaps you'll excuse them. Fact is, I never seem to want the card. I've never got one, anyway." Mrs. Paynter could not have taken that disreputable square of pasteboard with a more dainty grace had it been the most delicate and costly thing in the world. When she saw that great name imprinted on its front — it was just legible, no more — she swelled, positively and visibly increased in stature. With infinite condescension from her silver card-case she took a card, stiff as buckram, and even dazzlingly white. "Allow me to have the honour to present your Grace with my card." His Grace looked at the card. "Paynter? Any relation to Billy Paynter?" "What Paynter is that?" "Putney slogger, bantam-weight. Fighting man, you know." Mrs. Paynter drew herself up still more. My father was rector of Bodgington in Essex. He married a Miss Abbeyfield, my dear mother, and she was a grand-niece of the late Lord Gawler. My father was related, on his mother's side, to Admiral Piper. Percussion Piper he was called, as of course you know, because he was so explosive. And on his father's side, as I have often heard him say— The lady was well launched. His Grace, however, remorselessly cut her short. "Oh," he said. He turned to the young lady. "Miss Paynter?" "I certainly am my mother's daughter." Mrs. Paynter did not seem to be at all offended at having been recently interrupted. She came sailing gaily in. "Edith! Always Edith to her friends." "Awfully jolly name, Edith. Awfully jolly." Edith drew herself a little closer into her corner. "It is very good of you to say so." If Miss Paynter's manner all at once was a little glacial, Mrs. Paynter's continued to be beautifully beaming. "I cannot tell you how delighted I am at so unexpectedly encountering your Grace, and under such agreeable circumstances. It is such an honour, and such a pleasure. And you are going to Boulogne. Does your Grace purpose staying long at Boulogne?" "I don't know. Awful bore, the whole thing. Fact is, I am going to keep an eye on the old woman." His Grace winked, distinctly. But the lady was puzzled. "On whom?" "My wife." He winked again. The lady was taken aback, but she recovered. "Of course. I ought not to have forgotten that your Grace is married. So absurd of me. How is the dear Duchess?" "Eh? Who? Oh, Polly. She's going it, I hear." "Polly is the dear Duchess?" "Was Polly Perkins, the Pearl of the Peeries, you know. Used to be all the go at the halls. Her great song, you know, was 'He tallowed his nose with a candle.' Ever hear it? She could sing it. She sings it sometimes now, but she's got so jolly uppish that sometimes she will, and sometimes she won't." Mrs. Paynter looked slightly startled, as well she might be. The Duke of Staines was a young gentleman who was well calculated to startle her. Elderly ladies, respectable elderly ladies, read about such things in the papers and delight in them, but as they never actually encounter the principal actors in the scandals, they have not a favourable opportunity of judging what sort of characters those principal actors must really be. To Mrs. Paynter, the Duke of Staines was the Duke of Staines, with an accent on the. That a Polly whose great song was "He tallowed his nose with a candle" could be the Duchess of Staines, she couldn't realize the thing at all. However, she was a lady whose mental processes, under certain conditions, and in a certain sense, travelled quickly. "And is the dear Duchess," she was still the dear Duchess, "at Boulogne?" "Yes, hang it, and Dicky Datchet's with her too." "Dicky Datchet? Do you mean the Earl of Datchet?" "That's him." "Dear me, how sad! I never thought that the Earl of Datchet was that kind of man." "What kind of man?" "I always thought that the Earl of Datchet was a nobleman of the strictest propriety, as one of our first nobility ought to be, for the sake of the public example. It is expected of him." "What, Dicky Datchet? Well, I'm blowed. That's good." His Grace stared at the lady as though she were some strange animal. "I'll punch his head for him if he don't take care. I can fight if I can't do anything else. I'm not going to have him messing about with my wife, and I'll let him know it." His Grace was most affable and quite confidential. He told them the most amazing stories about himself and the Duchess and the Earl of Datchet, and other persons of similar rank and refinement, connected with the halls and otherwise. He was a most astonishing young man. He shocked Miss Paynter into speechlessness. Mrs. Paynter would not for the worlds have owned that she was shocked. When they were on the boat she made to her daughter this, under the circumstances, singular remark. "Edith, it is quite evident that his Grace is greatly struck with you." That wretched little cad? Mother, how could you let him go on talking? If I had been a man, I should have knocked him down. There is no doubt that he is a character, as a Duke of Staines can well afford to be. Edith, when I heard that the Earl of Datchet was going to travel by that train, I made up my mind that we would travel with him. I have more belief in the power of such beauty as yours than even you have. You have money, good birth. One never knows what may happen. Instead of an earl, chance has thrown a duke into your way. Edith, if you ever become the Duchess of Staines, my wildest dreams, at which you have so often laughed, will be more than realized. Aren't you forgetting that there happens to be a duchess? She is a person of the worst character, my dear. I remember the story now quite well. A most disreputable story. She entrapped him. This Earl of Datchet, who is plainly also a person of the loosest morals, I am deeply thankful that he wasn't in the train, is evidently philandering about with her. Under such circumstances, of course. The lady pursed her lips. Mother, for shame! Edith, don't be a fool. And you compare such a person as the Duke of Staines with Douglas. Edith, haven't I forbidden you to mention that man's name? Douglas is at least a gentleman. He's a penniless adventurer. Hush, here comes his grace. The Duke came. He addressed Miss Painter. Have a liquor? I beg your pardon? Have a liquor. Just a moistener. Gin and seltzer's not bad swill if you've got a knack of getting a little bit turned over, though I should think on a day like this anyone could look a basin in the face. What do you think? The young lady did not know what to think. This duke was such an extraordinary duke. The great middle class is aware that there are members of the British aristocracy who are deficient in brains, manners, morals, and even education. But as a matter of fact, even in these democratic days, individuals of that class seldom come into actual contact even with a baron, and when by some wondrous accident they stumble on a duke, they expect that duke to be a duke. If to all outward seeming he appears to be a cross between a billiard marker and a stable hand, they are apt to be surprised. When they reached Boulogne, his Grace of Staines was so good as to offer the ladies the honour of his escort to their hotel. As, however, they were leaving the boat together, someone stopped the peer. "Hullo, Teddy, what are you doing here?" The speaker was a gorgeously attired gentleman who wore, as decorations, a single eyeglass and a pair of spotless lavender kids. He was accompanied by a little lady who was remarkable for an enormous quantity of golden hair and a pair of large blue eyes which would have been filled with the light of innocence if their effect had not been marred by a superabundance of complexion. His Grace of Staines surveyed this pair with a glance which was not a glance of affection. "So it's you, is it? I ain't been long in finding you." "You might have been a bit longer, Teddy, if you'd dropped us a line to let us know that you were coming." "Your eyes." The pillar of the British Constitution used language which was not exactly ducal. "You'd better mind your P's and Q's, my lad, or I'll give you what for, and no mistake." The lady interposed. She took the eyeglass gentleman by the arm. "Come away, Dick, and for gracious sake don't let's have a row out here." The Duke seemed struck by the lady's words. "Come away with him, is it? That's good. You'll come with me, my girl, or by—" Mrs. Painter and her daughter drove away before the conversation became too personal. They did without his Grace's escort, that great nobleman appearing to be spoiling for a fight upon the quay, all the passengers and all the loungers looking on. "Mamma," observed Miss Painter as the vehicle began to rattle over the Boulogne cobbles, "I am not going to stay here. I am going straight to Paris." "Nonsense!" The elder lady was slightly flushed. "Don't be absurd." It was difficult to argue the question then and there. "At any rate, mamma, you will please to understand that nothing will induce me to have any intercourse with that wretched man." The mother said nothing. prudently. "I don't believe that he is the Duke of Staines." "As to that, nothing will be easier than to make inquiries. He would not be able to carry on that fraud long. Besides, I remember now quite well hearing that the present Duke was an eccentric character." "An eccentric character? You call that animal an eccentric character? Why, my dear mother, the man's a blackguard, an utter blackguard, neither more nor less." The words were strong, but the mother deemed it wiser to let them go unchecked, lest, peradventure, they should be followed by even stronger. Some hours later Mrs. Paynter paid a visit to Miss Paynter in the young lady's own apartment at the hotel. "Edith, there can be no doubt that he is the Duke of Staines." "It would make no difference to me if he were 10,000 times the Duke of Staines." "Don't talk nonsense, my love. The Duke of Staines is the Duke of Staines." "If that is the Duke of Staines, he certainly is, with a vengeance." "His income is nearer 3 than 200,000 pounds. And when he came of age he received nearly 2 millions in ready money." "Mamma!" The magnitude of the figures seemed momentarily to impress the maiden. "But you may be quite sure that the ready money is long since spent, and the income mortgaged up to the hilt." "You are entirely mistaken. Major Bagshaw, who is staying at the hotel, knows all about him. There can be no doubt that the Duke's manners are peculiar." "Peculiar?" "Well, aren't they peculiar? But it seems that his tastes are low rather than expensive. Major Bagshaw says that, financially, his position is even better now than when he came into his estate." "Mamma, what are you driving at?" "My dear, it is common talk that if he chose to apply for a divorce to-morrow, he would have ample grounds to go upon. If he married again — and he, of course, would marry." Mrs. Paynter paused. "The Duchess of Staines would occupy, if she chose, one of the proudest positions in England, a position which even royalty would be glad to fill. She would have everything which the heart of a woman could desire. She would have the world at her feet." End of section 27. Section 28 of The Seen and the Unseen by Richard Marsh. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Sonia. 12. The Duke, a Fiction of the Future. 2. "You're awfully down upon a fellow. I ain't used to it, you know." "No." It was after dinner. Miss Paynter and the Duke of Staines were alone together on the veranda of the Hotel des Bains. The Duke was smoking. He puffed at his cigar. He wore an air of injury. "No, I ain't, and so I tell you straight." "I am sorry." "Yes, a blooming lot of that, I make no doubt." "Might I ask where you acquired that conversational style of which you are so fond? It isn't only that you are habitually addicted to the use of slang. It is such peculiar slang. It always reminds me of — shall I say a 'busman'?" The Duke puffed in silence for a moment. "Do you know that I've never stood from any girl in England the half, nor yet the quarter, of what I've stood from you?" "And do you know that I have never had to endure from any man in England, not to speak of any gentleman, 1,000th part of what I have had to endure from you? Singular, isn't it? And you're a duke." "Well, I'm blowed! You're a oner." "Am I indeed? What is a oner?" "Look here, what is it you want? I'll give you anything you like. I've got something in my pocket now." From some mysterious inner pocket he took a flat leather case. He opened it. It contained a necklace of diamonds. "What do you think of that? Shiners, ain't they?" "I gave £5,000 for that little lot." She took the case into her hands. Her countenance betrayed no symptoms of surprise. "Did you? I have seen necklaces which seemed to me to be quite as good as this, which cost much less. I am afraid they overcharged you." "Not they. I may be a fool about some things. I don't need you to tell me that. But I'm all there when there's any money on. I'm not one to give 1 and 20 shillings for what's only worth £1. Not much I ain't." "Well, ain't you going to say even thank you?" Closing the case, the lady returned it to the gentleman. "Thank you. For the sight." "What do you mean? It's for you. I got it on purpose for you. It's a little present." "My dear young man, although you are a duke, pray don't be absurd. Do you see that light out at sea? I think it must be a steamer. I've been watching it for some seconds." "What's the good of humbugging? Damn the steamer! You know very well I'm gone on you. Fair gone. You know very well that the more you play off the more you drive me on. But I ain't going to stand it any longer, so I tell you straight." She was quiet for some seconds. Then she said, very quietly, still looking across the sea, "What do you mean?" "You know very well what I mean. You know I love you." "You love me?" Then she turned to him. A smile played about her lips. "And the Duchess?" "Oh, the Duchess! What has it to do with her?" "Your ideas are original. Good-bye." She turned right round. Passing through the open window, she entered the sitting-room. He followed her. "Don't put me off like that. Don't. Upon my word, I don't believe you know who I am. I'm the Duke of Staines." When he followed her, she turned again and smiled. "It's easy enough for you to laugh, but for all that I don't believe that you know what it means to be the Duke of Staines." "Although you are, doesn't it strike you that it is just within the range of possibility that you are insulting me?" "That's all nonsense. It isn't as though I was some low cad." "I see. You think that makes a difference." "Of course it does. Edith!" He was interrupted by a tapping at the door. A waiter entered. He had a letter on a salver. Miss Paynter took it. It was an English letter, addressed to her in a masculine hand and marked "Immediate." As her glance fell upon the handwriting, she flushed. "Edith," resumed the Duke when the waiter had disappeared. The lady cut him short. "You continue to insult me." The lady's manner all at once had changed. All traces of a smile had disappeared. Her eyes flashed fire. "Be so good as to let me pass, and this time do not follow me." "What is the good of all this humbug? What is your little game?" "Let me pass." She moved forward. He put his arm about her waist, but only for an instant. Almost as soon as he had put it there, he took it away again. The young lady swept past him through the window and out onto the veranda. Possibly one of the reasons which had induced his Grace of Staines to so speedily remove his too intrusive arm was the fact that Mrs. Paynter had entered the room. The lady came in very quietly. Miss Paynter's back had been turned to the door, so that, although the mother's entrance had been sufficiently obvious to the gentleman, it had been unnoticed by her daughter. When the younger lady had gone, the elder lady and the Duke remained face to face. The ball of conversation was opened by the lady. "Is it possible that your Grace was offering insult to my child?" His Grace had his hands in his trousers pockets. He seemed huffed and jerked his elbow towards the leather case which lay upon the table. "I don't know what you call insult. I was offering her that." "And pray what may that be?" "It's a present I got for her. I didn't mean it for an insult. It cost me a cool 5,000, I do know that." £5,000? Your Grace!" The lady took the case into her hands. She opened it. "Diamonds! And you have given them to Edith! What prodigal generosity!" "I don't know about given them, because she wouldn't take 'em." She wouldn't take them?
Jiggered if she would. She treated them as though they were bits of glass and I was a barber's clerk."
The lady reflected. Possibly she misconstrued the motives which actuated you in offering her so costly a gift.
"I don't see how she could, because I told her I offered it because I loved her."
"Because you loved her? Your Grace, I presume you mean in a platonic sense." Outside the window was Miss Paynter. When she first left the room she had passed to the end of the veranda, the precious letter marked "Immediate" held tightly in her hand. She opened it and read it in the dim light out there. It was short and pithy and sweet. "My darling, I have been offered a berth worth 800 a year. Such a stroke of luck. It isn't much, but there will be more to follow, and it's enough for a start. I vote we make a match of it at once. You said you would. I'm coming over by Friday's boat. Mind you meet me at the quay. Douglas." That was all the letter. Friday's boat. That's tomorrow. Douglas. There was a great tenderness in her voice as she emphasized the name. With the letter pressed against her bosom, she strolled back along the balcony. The sound of voices reached her. She had approached the open window of her mother's private sitting-room. The Duke was speaking.
"I don't know about platonic sense. I ain't good at that kind of thing. I know I'm fair gone on her."
There was a pause. Then her mother spoke. "I can only hope that I misunderstand your Grace."
"I don't know why you should. I tell you, I love the girl."
"Your Grace? And the Duchess?"
"Oh, blow the Duchess. If it comes to that, I'll marry the girl."
"Does your Grace then propose to commit bigamy?"
"Bigamy? Not me. I'll get a divorce."
Another pause. Miss Paynter, without, could fancy her mother's smile of bland maternal love. "Of course, if you were free, that would be another matter. And if a little bird tells the truth, you should have no difficulty in obtaining your freedom."
"Then a little bird just lies. Polly's as deep as they make 'em. She's not to be caught with chaff. She knows what it means to be Duchess of Staines. Trust her. She don't mean to get lost for nothing. Carry on to any amount she will, but just so far and not a small bit farther. I've had detectives on her track for the last 6 months, watching her night and day, but they tell me it's no good up to now." Still another pause. The young lady without could hear the Duke pacing up and down the room. "But I'll corner her at last, see if I don't. Then I'll marry Edith, if she'll have me. Upon my word, I ain't so sure that she will. I never saw such a oner. She treats me as though I was a dirty bagman. I'll give her anything, anything. I'll make her the greatest lady in England. I'll settle on her £20,000 a year. 20,000! I'll settle on her anything she likes."
While the distinguished nobleman within gave free rein to his chivalrous sentiments, the young lady without pressed the precious letter closer to her bosom. Her mother spoke, softly, almost purringly. "You see, your Grace places me in rather a difficult position. Having declared your affection for my daughter, it is necessary that I should protect her by every means in my power. Would your Grace object to giving me some sort of memorandum which would embody, in some form, the sentiments which you have just now uttered, and which do you so much honour?"
"I mean business, I tell you straight. Come along to my room, and I'll give you a written promise of marriage right off the reel. Hanged if I won't."
Mrs. Paynter went along with him. Miss Paynter heard the door shut after them. As she heard it, she knew that she stood within measurable distance of being one of the greatest women in England. A woman who, if she chose, might rule society. She knew too that, physically and intellectually, she was just a woman to play the part of social queen, that she would be a ruler who would have no rivals. she knew that she had but to stretch out her hand for all the gifts of all the gods to fall into her open palm. Yet she only pressed that letter closer to her breast. Several sitting rooms opened out onto that veranda. The French windows of the room adjoining were thrown right back. As she stood there thinking of all that grand future to which she possessed the open sesame, she was conscious that into that adjoining room had come two persons, a man and a woman. The man spoke. "Is everything ready?" The woman answered, "Everything." "The train leaves at 10 minutes to 2. We can catch the 5 minutes to 9 in Paris, and we shall be in Nice by a few minutes past 6 on Saturday afternoon."
"Dicky, you will be true to me?"
"Isn't it rather late in the day to ask me such a question? Don't you know I will?"
"But swear you will."
"I swear it for the 100th time."
"You will marry me afterwards?"
"I will, upon my honor." The woman's voice was low and earnest, even painfully in earnest. The man's tone was light and flippant. The woman drew a long, deep breath. Miss Paynter heard her, as she stood without, pressing the letter closer and closer to her breast.
"When I think of how I nearly jumped out of my skin for joy when I became the Duchess of Staines, it seems impossible that after all it should have come to this."
"Exchange is no robbery. You're going to be a countess for a change. Don't you think it sounds well enough, Countess of Datchet?"
"It's all very well for you to laugh, but you don't know what it means to me. You think what he thought. Because I was a music-hall singer, a serio-comic, the pearl of the Peeries, he thought that I was anybody's money. But I wasn't, and so he found, and so you'll find. Dicky, if you don't marry me directly you can, I'll murder you. I swear I will."
"There's not time enough for tragedy, Polly. Put it off until we're in the train."
"Do you think those brutes will follow us?"
"If you mean the detectives, I take it for granted that one, if not two of them, will be our fellow travellers to the sunny south. They will enjoy the trip at Teddy's expense." There was silence. The woman was pacing to and fro. When she spoke again it was in tones of the intensest bitterness.
"If I were to tell you what I've stood from that man, you wouldn't wonder at what I'm doing now. He's treated me worse than a dog from the moment he married me, and I was such a fool that I thought that if I was once the Duchess of Staines everything would be all right. He made no settlement on me. As for money, I haven't had it. He told me that if I sent any of my bills to him he'd thrash me within an inch of my life. And he'd do it too, especially if he had been drinking. He's never introduced me to a respectable woman. He had detectives to watch me."
"I know, Polly. I've heard some of it before, and I'll hear the rest when we're in the train."
"Look here, Dick Datchet. I've been an honest woman up till now, and although I'm going to run away with you, I mean to be an honest woman still. You put it down in black and white that you promise to marry me the very first moment you can."
"What would be the good of that? Such a promise wouldn't be valid. I can't promise to marry a woman who's married already. Besides, don't you love me enough to trust me? Come here, Polly." Although she could not actually see that it was so, Miss Paynter knew that the Earl of Datchet had taken the Duchess of Staines into his arms. "Don't you love me?"
"Yes."
There was the sound of a kiss.
"You know that I do."
"Then you may trust me to see you through it all." The woman drew another long deep breath, but she said nothing. "Hadn't you better go and get ready?"
"No,"
said Miss Paynter as she passed through the window. "I wouldn't if I were you." The Earl of Datchet was leaning against the table. The Duchess's waist was encircled by his arm. They stared at the intruder in not unjustifiable surprise. Miss Paynter addressed herself to the Duchess. "I wouldn't go and get ready if I were you."
"What do you mean?"
the Duchess replied. "Why, my dear child, because in real knowledge of this wicked world, I believe you're nothing but a child. You're only biting off your nose to spite your face. You're jumping out of the frying pan into the fire. This gentleman has not the slightest real intention of marriage. Have you?" This frankly put inquiry seemed somewhat to startle the Earl.
Really, I have not the pleasure.
Of knowing me? But I know you very well, both by sight and reputation. I assure you, my dear Duchess, that you would be a very foolish woman to trust yourself in the least degree to him." The Earl of Datchet roused himself to the best of his ability.
"May I ask, Miss Paynter, I believe you are Miss Paynter, what business this is of yours?"
"It is the business of every honest woman, to use the Duchess's very proper phrase, to save other honest women from being ruined and tricked by gentlemen. Don't you think it is?" There were voices without. "Here is the Duke, just when he is wanted." That distinguished nobleman appeared outside the window. Mrs. Paynter was with him. "Your Grace, prepare to be shocked, to receive a crushing blow. You have been deceived, betrayed, by a friend. Your own friend proposed to elope with your wife by the train which leaves at 10 minutes to 2 for Paris. Only I appeared upon the scene in the very nick of time." The Duke lumbered into the room.
"What the devil?"
he began, then he stopped. He glared at the Earl. The Earl beamed at him.
"Edith!"
said Mrs. Paynter, going to her daughter, who had her arm about the Duchess.
"What is the meaning of your peculiar behaviour?"
"Come into the other room. Come, Duchess, into the other room." When they were in the other room, Mrs. Paynter repeated her inquiry.
"Now, Edith, perhaps you will explain."
"I don't know that there is anything to explain, unless— Duchess, what do you think? I am going to be married." The mother gasped.
"You are going to be married, Edith? When?"
"Perhaps next week."
To whom?"
"To Douglas." End of section 28. End of The Seen and the Unseen by Richard Marsh.